اوكي هو بيكون بريف يعني.
Maybe half an hour. 30
half an
minutes.
hour, yeah.
30 minutes.
اوكي شوف يا اوكي الله يعطيك العافيه. Should we start then? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Would like to express our deep gratitude to the King Faisal Center for Islamic Research for hosting this event. Your Highness, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this lecture, which comes at a critical time, I guess, because it has been more than a year, well, pretty close to a year, since the Cairo speech by President Obama. Tonight's lecture title is The Obama Administration and the Middle East, the First Year. So it's like taking a whole year of evaluation, I guess, and an insight and foresight for the future as well. I don't want to take much time from my colleague, the lecturer, and I want to present him pretty briefly. Professor F. Gregory Goes III is Professor of Political Science at the University of Vermont and was Director of the University's Middle East Studies program from 1998 to 2008. In 2009 to 2010, he is the Kuwait Foundation Visiting Professor of International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. He was previously on the faculty of Columbia University between 1987 to 1995 and was Fellow of Arab and Islamic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York between 1993 and 1994. His research interests focus on the international politics of the Middle East, with a particular interest in the Arab Peninsula and Persian Arab Gulf. He has published 3 books: The International Relation of the Persian Gulf, Cambridge University Press, 2010, Oil Monarchies, Domestic and Security Challenges in the Arab Gulf States, Council for Relations Press, 1994, and the Saudi-Yemen Relations, Domestic Structure and Foreign Influence, Cambridge University Press, 1990. His scholarly articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Security Studies, Middle East Journal, Washington Quarterly, Journal of International Affairs, Review of International Studies, and other journals and edited volumes. He has testified on Gulf issues before congressional committees and has made numerous appearances on television and radio commenting on Middle East issues. Before completing his PhD, he held a research position in the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, and the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. In the spring of 2009, he held the Fulbright Fellowship at the American University of Kuwait. He received his PhD in Political Science from Harvard University in 1987 and his BA summa cum laude from St. Joseph University in Philadelphia in 1980. He studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo between 1982 and 83, and at Middleburg College in 1984. I'll let you go with our speaker. I'll give you, Professor Goes, 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questioning.
It's a great pleasure to be able to address you tonight and to thank you, and I want to thank you all for coming. I also want to thank my hosts, the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, for enabling me to spend the last 2.5 months in Saudi Arabia doing research on a book project on the development of the Saudi political system. Sumu al-Amir Turki al-Faisal, Allah yutawal umro, has been the best friend that Western researchers could have in the kingdom. His willingness to facilitate access for serious scholars of the country has changed the research climate here and is yielding excellent scholarship. Just this year, a number of important books in both English and French are being published on contemporary political and social issues in Saudi Arabia. The authors have all had access to the country through the King Faisal Center. I also want to thank the Center's Secretary General, Dr. Yahya bin Junaid, Dr. Awad al-Badi, and the rest of the staff at the Center for their help and their hospitality during my stay. I want to thank my ambassador, Ambassador Smith, for attending tonight. This gives me the chance to say that I am not an official of the United States government, and nothing that I say should be construed as official American policy. If you would like to know official American policy on any of the issues that I raise, you can ask Ambassador Smith afterwards. There was some talk at the King Faisal Center about me delivering this talk in my imperfect Arabic. Wiser heads prevailed, so you will not have to endure that experience. But the possibility reminded me of an experience I had in my graduate student days. I visited Yemen as part of my research for my PhD dissertation, which was on Saudi-Yemeni relations. And I had an interview with the late Sheikh Abdullah ibn Hussein al-Ahmar, who was the paramount sheikh of the Hashid Tribal Confederation. As many of you know, Sheikh Abdullah was one of the most important figures in recent Yemeni history, and I was very nervous when I met him. So I asked him my first question in my very halting Arabic, and he looked at me, and I'll have to say this in Arabic for the joke. He looked at me and he said, "Inta tatakalam bil-lugha al-arabiyya al-khawagiyya." You speak Khawaga Arabic. I said to him, "Ya Sheikh, ana Khawaga." I said, "I'm a Khawaga. Of course I speak Khawaga Arabic." So you should count yourself fortunate tonight that you don't have to listen to my Khawaga Arabic. The Obama administration entered office, as Dr. Al-Qahtani said, over a year ago, with a very ambitious agenda toward the Middle East. The new president wanted to wind down the American military adventure in Iraq, engage Iran after decades of mutual hostility, make a major effort to jumpstart the stalled Arab-Israeli peace process, take a new initiative on the Afghanistan war, and turn a new page in America's relations with the Muslim world in general and with the Arab world in particular, after the tensions and the conflicts of the post-9/11 period. This full agenda was somewhat unusual because the new administration seemed to have a much more restrained and limited view of its foreign policy goals more generally. It realized that American power, after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and after the debilitating war in Iraq, was not what it had been at the beginning of the 2000s. It sought to work not unilaterally, but through international institutions like the United Nations and the G20, moving away from the unilateralist and military impulses of its predecessor, the George W. Bush administration. Perhaps the Middle East has been an exception for the Obama administration in its generally restrained and, I would say, not very ambitious foreign policy agenda because of its central role in American foreign policy since 9/11. Perhaps this president was just more committed to changing American policy in this region because he saw the damage done to American interests by the last administration's policies here. In any event, the Middle East was the foreign policy exception in the first year of President Obama's term. An ambitious agenda, lots of direct American involvement, and a clear focus on the region from Washington. Unfortunately, Despite this high-level attention and the undoubted good intentions of this president, the administration has been able to accomplish very little in the region. Of course, there have been changes. The president's Cairo speech, his speech in Istanbul, both helped to improve the American image in the region. But these speeches also raised hopes for quick results on a number of fronts, most importantly on the Arab-Israeli issue. These hopes have not been realized, leading to feelings of disappointment, particularly in the Arab world. So the question before us tonight is why the United States has not been able to turn goodwill and good intentions into progress, tangible progress, diplomatic progress in the region so far. I think that the answer to this question lies in the circumstances, both in the United States and in the Middle East itself, which the Obama administration faced when it came into office. If we, analysts, had paid more attention to those circumstances, all of which constrain and limit the power of the United States to achieve breakthroughs in the region, we might have been less optimistic and more realistic about the prospects for results in this past year. The Obama administration came into office facing a series of domestic economic problems, including the most serious financial crisis since the Great Depression of 1929. It came into office at a time when the United States was fighting 2 wars in the Middle East, and neither one of them was going that well. It came into office burdened by an enormous national debt and declining public support for an active foreign policy in general. It had extremely ambitious domestic plans, most notably on health care. This is an administration that was forced both by circumstances and led by its own inclinations to spend most of its time and most of its political capital on domestic issues in its first year. That meant a few things for the Middle East. First, the president himself could not devote much time to it, to the region's issues. And we know that things only move here if an American president is personally involved. Second, it meant that the president would have to be careful about taking on controversial foreign policy issues, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, for fear of distracting attention from and losing support for his domestic initiatives. We know that in the face of serious political pressure, the administration backed away from its earlier commitment to pressure Israel to end all settlement activity in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. I'll say a little bit more about that later. What is clear is that despite its ambitious Middle East agenda, the Obama administration was not well positioned domestically to take on the difficult task of actually achieving progress on issues in the region. The regional realities on the ground in the Middle East itself were also not favorable for quick progress toward the resolution of disputes. For example, on Iran, it is impossible to say how President Obama's outreach effort might have worked if the domestic political situation in Iran itself had been more stable. There were occasional signals, both before and after the Iranian presidential election, that the Ahmadinejad government was willing to consider proposals for a compromise solution on the nuclear question. These signals offer slim but tantalizing evidence that things might have developed differently if domestic politics in Iran had been quieter. However, the upheavals in Iranian domestic politics following the controversial presidential election of June 2009 closed out the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough. Ahmadinejad, if he wanted a deal at all, and I admit that that is an open question, did not have the domestic political stability and strength required for such a breakthrough. the criticism leveled against him, both by his own allies, like Ali Larijani, and by his political opponents, like Hashemi Rafsanjani, over his apparent acceptance of the proposal to enrich Iranian uranium in France and Russia, indicated the domestic difficulties in accepting limits on the nuclear program. With the regime under pressure, its reflexive anti-Americanism, a position held most firmly by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, became a rallying point. The government blamed outsiders, including the United States, for its domestic troubles. The flexibility necessary for a major change of direction in Iranian policy was just not there, no matter how sincere Obama was about making a change. On the Arab-Israeli front, the realities of Israeli and Palestinian politics made progress toward peace very difficult to achieve. Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister of one of the most right-wing Israeli governments in history, just weeks after President Obama took the oath of office. This was not an Israeli government that wanted to consider difficult territorial compromises. On the Palestinian side, the government of Mahmoud Abbas and Salam al-Fayyad was clearly ready for serious negotiations, but they could claim to speak for only half of the Palestinian constituency and for only the West Bank. While Hamas leaders have in recent months evidenced some signs of willingness to engage in negotiations about an extended truce with Israel, no one in the Hamas movement is willing to meet the international community's basic criteria for a seat at the negotiating table: explicit recognition of Israel and direct talks with it. So President Obama and Special Ambassador George Mitchell faced an Israeli government unwilling to move and a Palestinian Authority with limited negotiating credibility. This combination of domestic constraints and regional difficulties is made very clear by the difficulties the administration has had in dealing with Israel over the past year. Its emphasis on an end to Israeli settlements throughout the occupied territories was, in my view, a very promising start if you're interested in Arab-Israeli peace. The vast majority of American Jews support an end to settlement activity. There are solid majorities of Israelis who take the same position. Even pro-Israeli members of the U.S. Congress, like House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Representative Howard Berman, publicly told Prime Minister Netanyahu that he had to face up to the settlements issue. President Obama seemed to have maneuvered the new Israeli government into a corner. But he then gave Prime Minister Netanyahu the leverage to extricate himself from that corner. By making a settlement freeze a condition for the beginning of negotiations, President Obama allowed Netanyahu to stall on the negotiations, negotiations which the administration wanted to see begin as soon as possible. It gave Netanyahu the chance to stall on those negotiations until Washington backed off from its demand for a complete settlement freeze. Netanyahu played this card very well, rallying domestic support in Israel against American pressure and holding out until Washington dropped its insistence on a complete freeze. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority, after the tactical error it committed in dealing with the Goldstone report, insisted on a settlement freeze before direct negotiations. With that position, Netanyahu was able to score a public relations victory in the United States by offering a partial and temporary settlement freeze, seeming to respond to American demands, knowing that this would not lead to the direct negotiations that he wanted to avoid. Now, most American analysts see the insistence on a settlement freeze as President Obama's major tactical error. They say it ruined the chance for direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I am of the opposite view. To me, the tactical error was to put so much emphasis on direct negotiations in the first year of the administration. Given the realities of both Israeli and Palestinian politics that I described above, direct negotiations between Netanyahu and Abbas were going to go nowhere. Better, in my view, to keep the focus on the complete settlement freeze and postpone the idea of direct negotiations until there was some change in the political situation on the ground, either in Israel or in Palestine. The virtue of this approach would have been to corner Netanyahu on an issue where he had little support in the U.S. and limited support even in Israel, and which is the core of an eventual peaceful resolution of the Palestinian issue. Unless settlements are stopped, there will be nothing to negotiate about at all. In any event, the Obama administration spent its first year being outmaneuvered by Prime Minister Netanyahu. It does not seem to have the stomach for another confrontation with him anytime soon. And I say this with full knowledge of the events of the past 2 weeks. While it's gratifying for me to see American officials like the Vice President and the Secretary of State publicly take Israel to task for settlement activity, we should not confuse that temporary emotional satisfaction with a real change in American policy. The East Jerusalem settlements are not being stopped. There has been no return to the administration's earlier insistence on a complete settlement freeze. We see no evidence that the administration is putting its own plan to deal with the final status issues between Israel and Palestine on the table. The proximity talks to which the administration is committed will face the same political obstacles as direct negotiations do, so they are unlikely to yield any progress this year. The high hopes and ambitions of the beginning of the administration have devolved, after a little more than a year, to a business-as-usual approach which offers little hope of swift movement to a just and complete settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I hope that I'm wrong about this, but I fear that I'm right. With Iran's unwillingness to respond to the Obama administration's offers earlier this year, we can also see a turn in the administration's policy more toward that of the Bush administration at the end of 2008, away from engagement and toward a policy of containment and pressure. Now, the containment element was always part of the American approach toward Iran. Washington wants to roll back Iranian influence in the region, be it in Lebanon through support of the March 14th movement and the Saad al-Hariri government, in Palestine through support for Fatah and the Fayyad government, in Yemen, and in Iraq. Its announcement of the sale of anti-missile systems to a number of the Gulf states is just the most recent manifestation of the American military commitment to its Arab allies across the Gulf from Iran. Speculation here in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf states that Obama wanted to reach a grand bargain with Iran that would be at the expense of Arab Gulf interests was always, in my opinion, an exaggeration. The U.S. commitment to a Gulf security system where no player, except the U.S. itself, is dominant did not change with the Obama administration. They're not looking to hand the Gulf over to Iran as some part of a grand bargain. But the pressure element is new for the Obama administration, which avoided such steps in 2009 as the administration continued to hope for a diplomatic breakthrough with Tehran. With those hopes fading, the administration is now trying to increase the pressure on Iran, but in a multilateral fashion. It hopes to gain support for new international sanctions on Iran and has increased its criticism, along with the countries of the EU, the European Union, of the crackdown against the Iranian opposition. How successful Washington will be on the UN sanctions remains to be seen. But there seems to be a commitment, even absent new UN Security Council resolutions, to work with European and other powers to develop multilateral economic policies aimed at pressuring the Iranian regime. Whether this new willingness to increase pressure on Iran will eventually lead to a military confrontation between the two countries remains uncertain. What is clear right now is that the Obama administration does not want to bomb Iran. Taking on a third military front in Southwest Asia, even if limited to air and naval operations, goes against the administration's instincts. It knows the consequences for regional stability of such a path, that those consequences would be very damaging. It knows that the economic implications for the world oil market of a military confrontation, for a world just coming out of a serious recession and financial crisis, would be very severe. It believes that it has a substantial amount of time before Iran becomes a nuclear weapons state, and thus it is in no hurry to risk a military strike. In my reading, the American military itself is very uncomfortable with the implications of an attack on Iran, given how vulnerable to Iranian response its troops in Afghanistan and Iraq are. The Obama administration has communicated to Israel its opposition to an Israeli strike on Iran, which seems at this time to be enough to deter the Israelis. It's worth noting that the Bush administration told the Israelis the same thing in 2008. What is not clear is how long this position will endure. President Obama is on record as saying that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable to the United States. And his Secretary of State has been even more bellicose in her statements about American opposition to a nuclear Iran. There is substantial congressional and media pressure for a tough stand against Iran, certainly from neoconservative and pro-Israeli groups, but also more generally. While the American public has no stomach for any new, prolonged military commitment, some polls indicate that there would be support for military strikes against Iran in the context of preventing it from becoming a nuclear state. So for now, the Obama administration is willing to ratchet up the pressure on Iran and hope that that will lead either to a diplomatic breakthrough or to some domestic change in Iran that will facilitate a new relationship. But how long it will wait remains to be seen. The Iran issue presents the clearest tension between Obama's inclination toward multilateralism and reluctance to embroil the U.S. in new military conflicts, and his clearly stated policy that the U.S. will not tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. I think caution will certainly dominate in 2010 as the U.S. draws down in Iraq and escalates in Afghanistan. But 2011 might be a decisive year on the Iran front. The one major Middle Eastern issue where the administration has consistently followed its original policy is Iraq. The Obama administration is committed to its plan to withdraw American combat units from Iraq by the end of 2011. Increased violence in Baghdad and in Anbar, Diyala, and Mosul provinces, Nineveh provinces, in recent months has not altered the administration's commitment to withdraw. Neither has the uncertain result of the Iraqi election. The Obama administration is willing to accept the decline in American influence within Iraq that this commitment to withdraw entails, because it sees the Iraq adventure as a profound strategic mistake. 6 years of a major American military presence and the spending of almost $1 trillion have not created a stable, pro-American, anti-Iranian Iraqi political system. Keeping American forces there for a longer period of time will not change that fact. This administration, in my view, wants to cut America's considerable losses in Iraq, both because it has pledged to its domestic political supporters that it will do so, and because the United States can no longer afford such an expensive engagement with such little strategic return. Washington realizes that this course of action will, in the short term, increase Iranian influence in Iraq. But Iran already has enormous influence in Iraq, with almost 100,000 American troops there now. Keeping them there, keeping the American troops there any longer will not reduce Iranian influence. There is hope that once the American presence is no longer an issue in Iraqi politics, that Iraqi nationalist feelings, some of which we saw reflected in the results of the most recent election, and the fractiousness of Iraqi politics will make Iran's position there much more difficult and weaker. But American withdrawal, in my view, is not predicated on that assumption. It will proceed after the Iraqi elections on an orderly timetable, and I think combat units will be out of Iraq on schedule. Now, this does not mean that every American soldier will leave Iraq. As Iraq has no air force, American planes will continue to patrol its airspace under agreement with the Iraqi government. American training and technical units will undoubtedly remain, again at the request of the Iraqi government. There will be residual American influence in Baghdad. But no one should doubt that the American military adventure in Iraq is coming to an end. Those in the region who assume, those here in the Gulf region, who assume that America will never leave Iraq because it hungers for more bases in the region, should remember that the United States already has plenty of military facilities in the Gulf, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the UAE, in Oman, with access to other facilities in Egypt, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, possibly in Turkey, and of course in Israel in times of crisis. What possible value would even more bases? In a country where the American military presence is a lightning rod of nationalist opposition, what possible benefit would bases in Iraq have? In my view, the only major uncertainty surrounding the American withdrawal from Iraq is whether the U.S. will leave some kind of military force in Iraqi Kurdistan as a signal of Washington's commitment to Kurdish autonomy. The Kurdish regional government would be overjoyed if that happens. The Kurds have strong support in Congress, so there would probably not be serious domestic opposition to that prospect. But leaving combat units in Kurdistan would be a clear signal of American support for the Kurdish agenda in Iraq, on Kirkuk, on the nature of federalism, and on other issues. As of now, there are no indications of American plans to, in effect, establish a permanent base in Iraqi Kurdistan. However, it would not be a surprise if this issue came up later this year as the American withdrawal gains momentum. Personally, I doubt that the Obama administration is interested in taking on a new American protectorate in the Middle East, which is what stationing troops in Iraqi Kurdistan on a permanent basis would mean. But it remains to be seen how the administration will react to this possibility. There are a number of other issues I could put before you tonight, from energy security to Lebanon to democracy promotion and human rights, which are part of the American policy agenda in the region. But I will leave those to the question period, during which I will be very happy to discuss them and any other issues you want to raise. But this review of three of the major issues of American Middle East policy, the Arab-Israeli arena, Iran, and Iraq, indicates that even an American president with the best of intentions is constrained by his own domestic political position and by regional realities when he deals with the Middle East. Many thanks for your kind attention, and I look forward to your questions and to your comments in either English or in Arabic as you feel comfortable. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Greg, for this elegant speech. Of course, we have a lot of questions, so we'll start with the verbal questions, those who want to say their question, and we have plenty. And we want to limit the time for only a couple of minutes so we can, take as much as we can. الأستاذ منصور عبد الله العمرو، إذا موجود الأستاذ منصور، تفضل. دقيقتين رجعنا يا أستاذ منصور.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سعادة المحاضر، شكرا جزيلا لك على هذه المحاضرة سعادة البروفيسور، وشكرا للمركز الملك فيصل. قبل سنوات وفي سباق الرئاسة الأمريكية كان أحد المرشحين يطرح وعودا انتخابية، ومن ضمنها وعود تتعلق بضمانات لدولة عدونا التقليدي، وأرجو أن تسمحوا لي بأن لا أخفي مشاعري هنا. كان هذا المرشح يبدو صهيونيا أكثر من الصهاينة، وأظن أن اسمه دوكاكيس فيما أعتقد. فوجئنا بأحد الخبراء الأمريكيين هنا يؤكد بشكل قاطع أن دوكاكيس لن يفوز بالرئاسة، وأنه جاء به ليكون مكملا للعبة الديمقراطية، وأرجع السبب إلى أنه يعود بأصوله إلى اليونان وليس إيرلنديا. فخامة الرئيس أوباما ربما ينطبق عليه مبدأ أنه الاستثناء الذي يؤكد القاعدة ولا يلغيها. هذه النقطة أعتقد أنها ضرورية لكي أطرح تساؤلاتي. إحباطنا يا سعادة البروفيسور الذي تطرقت إلى جزء منه ليس جديدا، وليس أقله تعطيل شيء من العدالة عن طريق استخدام حق النقض الفيتو فيما يتخذه مجلس الأمن الدولي وغيره من منظمات الأمم المتحدة من قرارات بشأن نزاعنا مع عدونا التقليدي. أعرف أنكم مجروحون مما حدث في 11 سبتمبر، لكن انتقامكم وثأركم كان مؤلما وقاسيا وعنيفا وظالما أيضا، لأنه طالما لا ناقة لهم ولا جمل في الموضوع. وحتى الآن لا تزال الطائرات الأمريكية التي بدون طيار تحصد أرواحا بريئة ما بين باكستان وأفغانستان. ولا ننسى أن الحليف الوحيد لأمريكا الذي سمح له باستخدام الطائرات التي بدون طيار هي دولة عدونا الصهيوني في حربها ضد قطاع غزة. الجندي الأمريكي يغتصب ويقتل في العراق أسرا كاملة ويحاكم في أمريكا وتتم تبرئته. والعربي أو المسلم الذي يقوم بأعمال إغاثة أو تجارة أو حتى أعمال مشبوهة أو مريبة يؤسر ويلقى به في معتقل وانتنامه دون إعلان محاكمة أو توجيه تهم. فيما يتعلق بقدرة إيران النووية، نحن نتابع التصعيد الأمريكي عند الحديث عن هذا الموضوع، لكن نلاحظ أن الاهتمام بدأ يتلاشى أو تلاشى تماما عن البرنامج النووي في كوريا، بالإضافة إلى أنه مسكوت عنه تماما فيما يتعلق بقدرة عدونا الصهيوني النووية أيضا. سعادة البروفيسور، محاضرتكم قيمة، لكن أرجو أن تسمح لي بأن أطرح تساؤل. لماذا تبدو السياسة وعلاقات التعامل وكأنها تسعى إلى نقل الأصدقاء إلى خانة الأعداء؟ أنتم إن لم تخسروا أصدقائكم فإنكم تحرجونهم كثيرا كثيرا كثيرا. شكرا لكم سيدي.
Yeah, sure. One more?
Or respond
You could,
one at a time.
no, you could respond, I guess. Yeah.
Well, there were a number of comments in there, and I respect the comments, but they're comments and not really questions, and so I'll just leave them as they are. I think that I would like to comment on a couple of issues. One is the nuclear issue and the hypocrisy of the American position of opposing the Iranian nuclear position. The speaker said being quiet about North Korea, and of course accepting the Israeli nuclear position. I think that we have to recall that the United States is a great power like any great power. And it defines its interest and then it follows its interest. And notions of justice or fairness or balance might play a role in the rhetoric of explaining the policy, but the policy is governed by interests. And I don't think that anybody should be surprised about that. I mean, this is, I think it would be extremely naive to think otherwise, right? The United States has interests in the region, and those interests push its policies, right? And thus, when the Israeli nuclear force is not seen by the United States as a threat to its interests, whereas the Iranian nuclear force is. I would take issue with the United States being quiet about North Korea. I don't know much about North Korea, but it does seem like there is significant American opposition to this. But I think it's a mistake for us to think that the policy of a great power, any great power, is governed by notions of fairness and justice. It's defined by its notions of its interests. And I think that that's the starting point for analysis. I think the important thing to recognize about American policy is that there's always tensions in those interests here in the Middle East. The tension between the desire to have good strategic relations for economic, military, and strategic reasons with states in the Arab world, and the special American interest with Israel. Right? That tension and managing that tension is in many ways the story of American foreign policy in this region. Sometimes the tension blows up and America can't manage it. And you have the oil embargo put on the United States in 1973 under the leadership of this country, under the leadership of King Faisal, whose institution we are sitting in tonight. Right? That was an instance where the United States could not manage the tension between its special relationship with Israel and its desire to maintain strategic relations with many Arab states. And the results for America were extremely damaging for American interests. And the result of that was the beginning of the modern peace process, with the United States becoming much more involved in trying to find Arab-Israeli peace in order to avoid this kind of tension, in order to avoid the contradiction in its interests here. But that is a rare instance. Arab governments very, very rarely impose costs on the United States because of its special relationship with Israel. And for any American politician facing his own domestic political situation, a confrontation with Israel is not something that he or she would seek out because it has domestic political costs. And thus, unless there is a cost put on the American policy of inclination toward Israel and support for Israel, unless there is a cost put on that, most American politicians will not confront it. And I think that that's just a reality that everybody in the region and all of us as analysts have to face. Right? When has America pushed on the Arab-Israeli issue? After 1973, when the costs of the conflict came home through the oil embargo. After 1990-91, where the costs of the tension, right, were clear in the Gulf War, as the United States had to manage the strategic imperative of fighting for the liberation of Kuwait against Saddam Hussein and its special relationship with Israel. It's only when those costs are apparent that the United States will move. Now, it's very interesting to note that in the last few weeks, a number of important Americans have raised this issue of the costs of a lack of progress on the Arab-Israeli front once again. General Petraeus, in testimony before a congressional committee, said that lack of progress on the Arab-Israeli peace process is a problem for American soldiers in the region. Right? Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates, both in indirect ways, made the same point. And if the press reports are to be believed, these points were made directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So maybe we're entering a period similar to the post-73 war period and the post-Gulf War period, where the United States actually sees a real cost to its support for Israel and lack of progress on the Arab-Israeli peace process. And we'll see if that's going to be a change. As I said during my talk, I don't think there will be a major initiative here, but perhaps I'm wrong, and I can hope that I'm wrong. Just the last point, if I could, that the United States places its friends in the region, its Arab friends in the region, in a very, very difficult position, I think is absolutely clear. But I think it's important for its Arab friends in the region to make that clear to Washington, and not just rhetorically, right? They have to tell Washington, right? To be taken seriously, they have to tell Washington that there are things they cannot do that Washington wants them to do if there isn't progress on the Arab-Israeli front. Because without that, American politicians aren't faced with the costs of their current policy. And so it seems to me that the key here is to recall that there is this tension and this contradiction in American policy. And America kind of skates over it and plays it and maneuvers it most of the time fairly well. But if you want the United States, right, to seriously look at its position on Arab-Israeli issues, you have to hold its feet to the fire.
Dr. Greg, you might just sit down and answer the question. It would be more comfortable for you if you would like.
I think better on my feet.
Okay, that's fine. Dr. Musharraf Naim.
Good evening, Greg.
Good evening,
everybody. Okay, I'd like to draw your comments, Greg, about 2 points. The first one is the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Of course, we all know, and as you have indicated, the sensitivity of the land issue to Israel. And of course, all the Arabs have been very patient, the moderate, especially the moderate states. They have given Washington lots of time. And as we saw in the last Arab summit, they were willing to give Washington 4 or 6 more months to deal with this. So I'll go back to your earlier comment about the unilateral attitude Washington has been focusing on the Palestinian issue. And I would like to draw your comment about this possibility, this scenario. Now, the Arabs have always indicated that peace is a strategic option for them, and they're not willing to consider other means. Is a realistic way out of this dilemma, which might be better for the Arabs, for the moderate states, and for Washington, for the Obama administration particularly, to relieve some of the pressure and the sensitivity of the issue to go back to the quadrilateral and to a multilateral conference in Moscow, as has been suggested, and as Washington previously has agreed to. So I think this is a way to move a little bit on this road. Now, the other thing is the Israeli-Syrian question, which, of course, you have not covered here. And I think it has a great impact, might have a great impact on the Palestinian issue and on the Palestinian internal division. And it has, it doesn't have this sensitivity side, the Golan Heights. So, do you think that the Obama administration might come to the conclusion that dealing with having a success, a realistic success, might be focusing in Syria, and they could have a deal maybe within 1 year or 2 years before the Obama administration goes out? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mashari. That's a great point. I didn't mention it, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if I had had 5 minutes of the president's ear on the day he took the oath of office, and he said, "What do you think about the Arab-Israeli thing?" I would have said, "Go to the Syrian track." Syria is a state. It has a single government. It can negotiate. It had expressed its willingness through indirect negotiations through Turkey to resume the peace talks with Israel. I think that the Syrian regime is ready for full peace. I think it was ready for full peace in 2000 when the talks broke down, and broke down, at least in my reading of the evidence, because the Israelis weren't willing to go for full withdrawal. it seems to me that would have been a potentially